Alrighty. Back in for the RC. Things are good. Cool. This is not what I want to run. Let's see. I did a little bit of work on the demo. Why is that recompiling? What did I change? Oh, I know what I did. File watcher is how I was running it before. Feature flags. I did some triplanar stuff. The UVs are still a little bit off. The texture that is the default texture isn't quite the same as the texture that is whatchamacallit, being added in through other means. That is partially due to this UV thing that I haven't integrated with the triplanar mapping, but otherwise this is triplanar mapped vertex color height lerped texture. So there's two textures here. There's the underlying texture and the sand texture, and you can see that there seems to be quite a bit more going on there than just two textures, which is very cool. Hey Ramon, how's it going? Hey Xavier. Vampire, nice. Vampire Lestat. That's from that TV show, right? I have not seen that TV show, but I know that name. One thing that I probably want to do today is upgrade this demo to 0.17.0-rc. I redeployed my personal site, so now I have a personal site again. Yay! Now I can put more writing up. Let's get rid of this. Over here. One quick thing before I do. This is Leptos static site deployed on Netlify, shipping Wasm on the client. It's very nice. I like it a lot. A lot of my content got pulled down as a result of just trying to get something out to ship. But I'll rebuild stuff up. It'll be fine. Been a while since I caught this, let alone so near to when you start. Yeah. Hey Graham, how's it going? 0.17's release candidate is out. Let's see, do I have a Chrome window that I can pop open? Docs.rs Bevy. So if you're interested in the release candidate, you have to go down to this drop down, go to RC1. Ta-da, this is RC1. I've already updated quite a few things. Skeen already got an update. So Skeen is out and published. 0.1.11 for the whatchamacallit, Blender add-on. Supports 0.16 and 0.17, and then 0.3 RC1 is the 0.17 version of the Rust crate. But I'm very happy with having the Blender add-on work with both versions at the same time. So it doesn't matter, because managing the Blender plugin, depending on which Bevy project you're working on, is really annoying. So I'm very happy with that. But that's all. Bevy ECS tile map has a PR up. There's one more thing that we need to do for Bevy ECS tile map. That I actually am not sure what the answer is going to be just yet. There is a... See, I have the repo open locally. This prepared bind group does not have the data anymore, and that was part of the type erased materials change. So I need to figure out if this is important, and I was just too tired last night to figure that out. I've also started upgrading the Bevy examples. So let's see, the edge detection example with the custom render phase works. Oh, I forgot I did clicking on stuff removes the component. That's really cool. I forgot about that. Let's see, what are the changes so far? Well, actually, let's go look at the RC, because there's no page yet for the release. But if you go into the release content directory, There are migration guides if you have a project that you're going to upgrade and release nodes. What do you use for the outlines? That's a custom implementation that is meant for educational purposes. So that is a, where's the code here? There's two pieces to it. One is a custom render phase, and the other is a post-process step. And there's two shaders, one for the post-process and one for the custom phase. The custom phase basically builds a, I think I can actually just, features Bevy file watcher. Cool. This should exist somewhere. Where's this? Let's do the load. I leave this code in here so that I can do this occasionally. Oh, but I need to make the other change too. Right. I don't know that I really want to do that. I'm going to leave it. In any case, there's a set of data, basically. So we have all of the meshes that we render in Bevy, right? And those go through the regular pipelines, regular render graph, everything goes through. It picks the color on the screen, everything's fine. You can set up a custom render phase that takes all of those same meshes and renders them out to a separate texture. And I do this additionally to adding vertex data. So all of these surfaces have vertex colored data on them. That vertex data via this custom render phase gets rendered out into a section texture, or like an ID texture. That basically, if you look at these different things, like these white areas are a great example. Because the white areas are just a value of 1 on that entire surface. But there's a bunch of different values in the red channel from 0 to 1 to label each of these. That's why you can get the cube to have outlines in the middle on this one, but not on this one. Because this is all the same color. They're all the same red channel color. And this is a couple of different red channel colors. A different one for each face. And then the white face is actually just one, fully saturated. So you can color those edges in by doing that using the quote outliner or not. Yeah, so then you take that like red channel texture that you rendered out, you pass that into a post process, and that's what's doing the outlines. So it's just a Sobel filter. If I remember correctly, I'm still using the Sobel filter. I had a Roberts cross in here just so people could see the difference. But yeah, based on that texture, if it's 0, there's no outline. If it's close enough to 1 to be 1, then it's fully closed in. And otherwise, we do the Sobel filter to determine where the outlines should get drawn. So it's not using a crate or anything, but that is up on GitHub. That whole repo is in this repository. So Rust Adventure Bevy examples. There's a concepts folder, there's an examples folder, and there's a libs folder. The examples folder has an edge detection custom phase, and that's what that is. And here you can see some of the colors and stuff. It does use like HDR. So unless you do specific processing, it can be hard for you to see it. But here you can see like this cube has different colors on each face due to that vertex data. So does this triangle, but the torus and other things don't, and this cube on the left doesn't. So it's kind of like an artistically driven, something you could paint on in Blender approach to doing outlines. Where is it going? Hey Joyboy, how's it going? That's a new video that I was working on. Where was I going to go? Right. So if you're looking to do the 0.17 release candidate, in the release content directory is where everything gets kept these days for the releases. There's migration guides and release notes. Migration guides are useful if you are trying to upgrade a project that you already have. This is basically like a summary of all of the PRs that have actually changed anything. So WGPU 25. There's this rather pervasive change for all materials where this like I don't know what to call this. It's like shader def, I guess, got introduced. So now instead of doing like group 2, you do group material bind group. Some other changes were related to this too. If you do a custom, like the custom render phase needed to introduce an empty group for bind group 1 due to some changes in WGPU. A whole bunch of other shit. But if you're looking for new features, that's release notes. So release notes is stuff like Bevy Solari. Solari is real-time ray tracing, but it's just I would kind of classify it as prototype at the moment, or like experimental, or whatever, like whatever word you want to use for that. It is very cool. It is not production ready. Some UI stuff. You can now write shorter versions of the UI code if you're picking whatchamacallit, values. There's from and into implementations for Val, I think, at this point. I don't know if these are in the prelude or not. I haven't used them yet. There's a GLTF thing, DLSS, entity spawn ticks. Feathers is interesting. Feathers is like a Bevy UI component library kind of deal. I think also not ready yet, so still behind an experimental flag. But cool to see, because that's like editor related stuff. Frame time graph. I'm not sure I'm familiar with this one. What is this one? Frame time is more important to know than FPS. Temporal nature. Yeah, okay. The graph of every frame time. That's cool. FPS overlay. Oh, so we get a bar graph now? That's sweet. That's pretty sick. There's a bar graph of the frame time, or the time it took to generate each frame. That's pretty sweet. Generic component propagation. What is that? Oh, generally, yeah, generalizing the hierarchy propagation. So I think this works with arbitrary relationships now. Yeah, transforms and visibility have this built in, and over time the infrastructure used to power transforms and stuff has been getting a little bit more generic. So now there's a hierarchy propagation plugin. I haven't used this at all yet. It's very interesting. This use case is interesting. Synchronizing color and alpha values for ghost versions of previewed buildings. So changing the alpha for everything in a scene hierarchy. Each copy of the plugin will propagate components of type C down the hierarchy along all entities which match the query filter of type F. with this plugin enabled, you can add a propagate component. Cool. I feel like this could be cool for people spawning GLTF colliders that don't really want to do any Blender work. Where you add like a collider constructor or something. Or maybe collider constructor hierarchy already exists in Avian. But I know that Rapier doesn't have a similar thing. Or I don't think Rapier has a similar thing. So that could be useful for Rapier. Hot patching is a huge thing. It is also experimental. I feel like there's a lot of experimental stuff in this release. But this is basically like Rust code hot patching, I guess is what we're calling it. I don't know why we chose a different name. It doesn't really have any meaning to users other than hot reload. It's like hot reloading for Rust code. When I asked about the naming, people kind of said, oh, well, the implementation is slightly different. And I was like, okay. I think that in general, people are going to call this hot reload, just like everything else. But there are some significant restrictions that are why I haven't been using it personally. It only works on the binary crate, and I almost always have a main and a lib. It's not supported in Wasm. I guess it's supported in Dioxis, so that's cool for Wasm. Signature change for functions and stuff, I guess, or like component types wouldn't be able to hot reload. This is the other thing about hot reload that is like, I don't want to call it a foot gun, but it's every hot reload system I've seen over the last 10 years has had issues with either state or things like function signature changes or things like that. So I'm a little bit hesitant to be like, oh, this is going to be a really cool new thing that everybody's going to be able to use for everything. It'll be useful. It'll work for certain things. But I'll have to see it work more often than not before I really trust it. I think that hot reload in other ecosystems, not Rust, not Bevy, generally tend to break in certain ways, and you have to learn the ways in which they break to know if what you're doing is like effectively stale state from a failed reload or not. So you kind of always have to fall back to a full reload. So yeah, I don't know. It's very, 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 very cool tech. It's also very, very, very early. So I don't want to sound like I'm harping on it too much, or like, because it's very cool. It does work in the cases that it is designed to work for. It is just not, it's not out of experimental yet, is the way I would put it. You suppose this works by having a main exec that does close to nothing, the rest is some shared objects, so those are hot reloaded. Something like that is my understanding, yeah. I haven't looked into it too much because I'm not planning on working on it. And I don't particularly care about the implementation details in that sense. But that code is all open source. This is just a whatever it's called, crate that hasn't been published yet. Unfortunately, it is in the Dioxis CLI, as far as I'm aware. So if you do want to actually look into the implementation, you do have to go into this thing that is kind of like part of a whole separate project. Let's see, CLI. Is subsecond in here, or is it actually part of CLI? RS. Subsecond. So here's subsecond. I think there was a blog post about this too. Doesn't say how it works inherently, so let's see. Dioxis subsecond blog post. It's also important to note that Dioxys did do the work here. Like, they are the reason this exists. That's Tori. Is this it? There was something else. There was some other post. It was, I think it was on their personal, maybe. Yada yada. Don't know. Can't remember where I saw that blog post. But there is a blog post about the implementation and what it actually does. And the code is also open source. So if you want to go check it out, you can actually do that. How it works. There we go. Detouring function calls through a jump table. The jump table contains the latest version of the program's function pointers. And when the function is called, subsecond will look up the function in the jump table and call that instead. Subsecond doesn't modify process memory. Patching pointers is wildly unsafe, so apparently they don't do that. Compiles only the parts that change, links them using the addresses of the functions in the running program, and then sends the new jump table to the application. Subsecond then applies the patch and continues running. So it's basically like they're sticking something in the middle of all your function calls, and it goes through that jump table and then gets sent to a different function, depending on when it actually needs to go. Plan to add full workspace support, but workspaces are currently not supported. Even as simple as having like a main and a lib break this. So it's interesting that that's a Rust C issue that they're saying, the build graph in Rust C. Anyway, that's a very cool, interesting thing, but it's fairly experimental. If it works, I've heard of people using it for things like if they want to do UI work, they have a separate Bevy application somewhere else on their system enabled with hot reload. And they go over there whenever they want to do UI stuff, and they do it in the hot reload project. So maybe not for your production application, but maybe for like a side crate, you know? Key button inputs. Sure. Light textures is very cool. I think light textures are limited to Windows. This is one of the things I would really like to at some point look into. This pipeline of functionality, because this builds on top of some other stuff that's also Windows only, and I think that's why it's Windows only. But these are light textures or light cookies. So if you look at Tunic, lighting, Tunic lighting. Oh, that's cool. Somebody recreated it. Game. This is the game. Open image in new tab. So all of this lighting on this bridge, like the hotspot down here on the right, the hotspot over here, the hotspot below the enemy, all the little like dappled lighting pieces, that's all light textures. So it's basically like a light, a texture, which is like a mask or a gobo or whatever. In Bevy, there's no like light texture shader, so to speak. So if you want to animate light textures, you would have to render to texture and then use that texture on the light. I want to create an example of that at some point, which is one of the things that I want to do for this Tunic demo. but very, very, very cool. See, render now has a startup function. The render world now has a startup function, similar to like the main world. Observers got overhauled completely. So did events. We'll talk about that in a second. Reflection, auto registration now happens. So if you reflect component data, that will now auto register, which is nice for things like Scheme, but also just in general. I feel like forgetting to register types was a common failure mode. This is one of the things. Actually, we should work on this today. We have the concepts folder in Bevy examples, and this is a major update to the way that will work. So we'll leave this for a little bit. We'll get into observers in a second. I think the Raymarch stuff for atmosphere and whatnot doesn't really hit without an image. So I don't know, we'll leave that too. But the atmosphere code and environment map filtering and stuff is getting better and better. You can use Bevy scene and stuff in isolation. That's that. Specialized UI transform. There's some desire to like have a specialized 2D transform versus a 3D transform, as well as like a UI transform. The UI transform just got implemented. The 2D transform is not yet, although there's a working group, I believe, working on that currently. Some naming changes for system sets. Window independent scale factor. Ooh, yeah, nice. Okay, so the scale factor of text is now based on the render target, which is really nice. Text 2D shadows. Are these real shadows compared to the fake shadows that we already have? Oh no, it just grabbed on. Yeah. I think this is the same shadows we had for the UI text, but for text 2D in the world. Text background colors. There's a new tile map implementation in 0.17, which is very cool. It is very bare bones, but it does exist. So if you're trying to render, say, a PNG, basically, out of tiles, you might be able to use the tile map, tile data, tile chunk stuff in 0.17. Eventually, I hope that grows big enough to kind of like take the place of Bevy ECS tile map, but it's not there quite yet. UI gradients, viewport node, and web assets are the only two things that I haven't seen. Viewport node. Ooh, render camera output directly to a UI node. Yes, that's sick. I missed this. I've been a little busy over the last month, so there's a couple things that I haven't seen go in. This is so sick, actually. This is like... Okay, that's very cool. We'll have to build a demo out of that. And then what was the other one? Web assets. Web assets is HTTP and HTTPS URLs as asset paths. It's interesting. I guess theoretically, if you wanted to hit an API for an asset, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the use case when I would be hitting. I guess for like blue sky avatars, right? Like user profile avatars from. Oh, I can't remember the name of that thing that WordPress did. That was all the user email-based avatars or whatever. But if you wanted to pull a bunch of those in, you could do that now using the asset server, which is very cool. So let's do the example stuff. Get into some actual updates. I'm most of the way through most of this. Hooks and observers is something that we will need to change. Fresnel effect is the next one. Cargo run bin. Edge detection works. The dissolve sphere works. Doesn't have the shadow applied though. I need to go back and fix the shadow. Cube wave is also working. Pretty straightforward upgrades there. Fresnel is our next one. So to do the upgrades here in main, shader ref moved, or a bunch of different like there's a bunch of new crates, I guess, in 0.17. Like Bevy light is a new crate, Bevy shader is a new crate. Where's shader ref? I'm just going to use Rust Analyzer to tell me where this is. So Bevy shader ref is where shader ref comes from now. Bevy light is where the lighting information comes from now, or lighting stuff comes from. This is probably a bind group error. Yep. So this is happening on effectively every material that I have ever implemented. In device, we're in the opaque mesh pipeline, doesn't really matter. We're in the fragment shader, which is interesting to know in case you're looking for like where this is. Shader global resource binding group 2 binding 0 is not available in the pipeline layout. And what that means is, this doesn't give us a file name, does it? That's really unfortunate. This is one of the reasons that I kind of advocate for having a bunch of demos for each of your materials. So like in your project, have a bin folder. That bin folder or examples folder should have just all of the materials that you have in your project applied to like a cube or something or whatever they're going to be applied to, so that they can be like compiled and run separately from everything else, which will help you narrow down these issues, which you might not get a file name for. Like imagine trying to figure out which WGSL file this is. Let's see, where's Fresnel? Fresnel's here, normal visualizer. So this group 2 binding, we'll have to change. Forget exactly what it is, so let me go grab it from something else. Something that actually has it. This is a really awkward like change, I feel like. So group 2 versus group material bind group as like a shader def that gets templated in. Like I get why this exists, but it's very awkward in terms of like teaching people how things work or like whatnot. Because like how do you figure out which bind group this is now? You don't. It's not in the code. But the upgrade is fairly simple, straightforward. So we got to do ray march sphere. This is for now, ray march sphere, assets, SDF. This is going to have the same issue, so we'll just get ahead of that. Apparently WGSL Analyzer wants to do some formatting. What do we have here? Material 2D plugins no longer come from Bevy Sprite, is that correct? Let's get rid of that. Let's say import this. Sprite render is now the crate where that comes from. Shader ref now comes from shader ref. Material 2D. You can just go through and like let Rust Analyzer pick these locations for you. That's the way that I do it anyway. It's really doesn't fit my brain very well to memorize all the paths. I like to have Rust Analyzer do that. Is rotating column not included? Interesting. Let's see, rotating column. I didn't upgrade that to, yeah, okay. So we'll leave rotating column there for a second. Cargo TOML for shield spheres. Shield spheres probably has a similar issue. That's commented out right now, is it? Yes, it is. We'll move on from the spheres for a second. The Noiseland one, I feel like I look at the Noiseland one and it's like something that I did a long time ago that I'm not sure is actually useful for people in general. Did I actually already get rid of this? If it's not in the cargo TOML, I'm going to delete the folder. No, it's here. Okay. Hades start menu is something that I need to move into a different project. I still want to do a whole series of videos on like start menus and stuff. I kind of held off on that a little bit until the UI stuff got a little bit better. You actually went through the Bevy getting started guide. You were able to get it with limited Rust knowledge. That's sweet. That's awesome. What are you going to build? Or what is what's brought you to Bevy? Vertex attribute values needs a different import. Get this import. Cargo run bin 2 UVs. 2 UVs. Shader ref. This is just an example that uses 2 UVs. That's it. Let's see, assets. This is a standard material extension then, right? Yes, it is. So the question is, standard material extension, does that do the same thing? What's the actual issue here? Group 2 binding 100? Assets in which file? So here's another one, right? We've got a fragment shader. We've got decals here, group 2 binding 100. That probably needs it. UV2 probably also needs it. But like in this error message, we don't get the file name. Though this is a small enough number of examples and the changes are consistent enough that I can just apply them. I've already done this upwards of 10 times already to other shader files. So, but I highly suggest doing that thing that I said earlier with individuals. You like Rust more than GDScript. You'll eventually build a Japanese learning game. Sweet. That's awesome. I know 0 Japanese. All right, what is this? UI button shader. What, shader ref somewhere? Yep, shader ref. Bevy shader ref. Can I combine these? Rust Analyzer, please? Oh well. You send it to you and you build it? Nice. So here's an SDF. This is a UI shader, UI material shader. That kind of like emulates a liquid for a certain level of health. I think it's pretty cool. I think there would need to be some more work on it if it was going to be used in an actual game. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it. It's just SDFs and, you know, like sign functions and stuff. Yeah, like it looks cool. Like it could be used in something somewhere. I don't have a place to use it. I don't have a cute like Animal Crossing game to put this in. But it was fun to build. And I hope other people find it useful to learn from. Okay, so I think that's all of the examples that we're going to update for now. And we're into the concepts directory, which is what I wanted to get to. So let me... Are we in a branch here? We're not in a branch. GCOB Bevy 17. Commit m examples and libs. So the other thing is the Bevy blockout already got an update. It was the same changes. There's nothing else to it. This is the triplanar shader that I was building before. I don't know. It was a little bit ago now. So I guess I can publish this since it's fixed. Let's do that. So 0.2 rc.1 for blockout. Cargo run, or let's go cd libs bevy blockout publish. This should just work. I committed everything, right? Yeah, cargo publish. What? Oh yeah. Publish bevy blockout. So this will take a second. And then shader utils also ready to go. Can just publish this. I don't publish everything in this directory, but shader utils and blockout are like vaguely useful. Bevy blockout is kind of like a texture to use if you don't have a texture yet, that I think is pretty cool if you're just like doing level design or layout or something. And then you can always replace that later. I was thinking about doing something with Bevy blockout where I would also supply a Blender shader node graph, so that the way that it looks inside of Bevy and the way that it looks inside of Blender were the same, which would be very cool. I already supply, like, I already build Bevy Skeen and I supply components that can be used in that way, that automatically on hook will grab the standard material that gets exported from Blender and apply the colors and stuff. So there's some changes you can already make. But it would be cool to see inside of Blender as well while you were doing level design. Cool. So that's published. Bevy shader utils. Bevy shader utils. Cargo publish. I already did the updates for this, so it's just taking the RC and publishing it. And then we twiddle our thumbs while it checks to make sure that we didn't break everything. This is the Silksong discussion portion of the stream. Has anybody finished Silksong yet? I'm just watching this finish up because it is actually a publish. If it was just compiling something or testing or whatever, I would let it go on its own. Three, two, one, published. Perfect. Cool, so we're all set to do the observer updates. Let's do... Are these packages? I think these are packages. Hooks and observers. So we've got a bunch of changes for the hook context imports. Hook context comes from somewhere else now. So right here, it's in Bevy ECS component hook context. This is a component hook. Come on, Rust Analyzer. And now it's in Bevy ECS lifecycle hook context. Otherwise, I think hooks stayed pretty much the same. I don't think there are any new hooks. I should go check. I think deferred world might come from somewhere else too. Let's go read the observer overhaul. And really, when I see observer overhaul, it really is like events, observers, and potentially component hooks overhaul. Events got renamed to messages. Observers got renamed to event or observers and triggers. I forget what the naming we landed on is. Everything used to be an event, and the APIs weren't static enough, and yada yada yada. So in 0.16 we had this event trait. That event trait in 17 is much smaller, and it's observer events. So an event is an observer event now. Hey, you were out of Bevy for a few months. Any updates on Bevy editor and scenes? Bevy editor and scenes, yes. So the current updates for scenes is there's a draft PR up for BSN. BSN, unfortunately, is not going to make it into 0.17. You'll have to wait for 0.18 or main, because this is going to move pretty quickly, I think, after the 0.17 release. But BSN looks like, I don't want to commit anybody to something that they didn't commit to, looks like it's going to merge for 0.18, which is great. This is a draft PR with an implementation and whatnot, all for discussion. You can see what it's going to look like concretely, etc., etc. Big PR here. A lot of reviewers, a lot of tags. It is in the 0.18 milestone, so I'm not talking out my ass when I say 0.18, but I also, like, just because it's in the milestone doesn't mean it is going to ship for 0.18, although I know that is something people want to happen. So a bunch of that. And then what was the other question? Bevy editor. Bevy editor, there are a couple of updates, mostly around UI and widgets and things like that. The Bevy editor itself is not in a shippable state for 0.17. There's various opinions on what the editor should actually end up being. But Bevy feathers and headless component widgets are two things that have launched with 0.17. Feathers is experimental. It's a UI library. You know, it's effectively like Bevy's Bootstrap, if that makes sense, or Bevy's Tailwind or whatever. What else is there? I think those are the major notes. There's serious progress, yeah. I think that it's such a big thing that so many people want that there's a lot of context around it, is the way that I'll frame it. But there's serious progress being made, which is very cool. Thank you. Another question. What if we create an editor that uses Bevy just like tiled export JSON, we export RON? I mean, you could do that today. The one thing that I will say is that in that BSN draft PR, there is BSN to world, but not world to BSN. I don't know what world to BSN is going to look like. I'm not sure that anybody really knows what it's going to look like. Maybe Cart does. So BSN as a world to file serialization seems less defined than BSN to world. And if you're asking me, like, what if we create the Bevy editor that uses Bevy just like tiled exports JSON? Yeah. I mean, creating an editor using Bevy now that outputs an asset format that is then ingested into Bevy is like, that's a thing, right? Everybody can do that. You have a simple editor that can preview RON scenes and run projects as a separate window. Sweet, that's sick. Yeah, I think there's a couple of projects that do similar-ish kinds of things. A lot of them try to be like in-game editors, where you end up with like a Bevy eGUI set of panels, etc. A soldo bandana. I assume you try to post the... Is that banana or bandana? Bandana. A sold dough. I don't know why I did A. Banana. Or bandana. I can't. Cool. Save scene, run cargo check. So is there like click and drag support and stuff? I think that personally, I don't feel a lot of the pain here because I use Blender for all of this. Not yet, too early. Yeah, fair. Nice. It's valid, yes, absolutely valid. Probably long term, you're going to target BSN, the asset format, but that won't be until 0.18 or later, so I wouldn't worry about it. Will you have issues with Bevy 0.17, 0.18 plus? No. So the scene format as it exists right now, that thing that can like serialize to RON and come back, that's sticking around. I think there are still use cases, especially the world to asset format use case that you're talking about is supported by scene, but is not supported by BSN right now. So scene as it currently exists has to exist in some form to support that use case, right? And the only time that that is going to get removed is if BSN also supports that use case. So you're good for now. I space out and don't know which thing I'm doing. Okay, observers. Hot patching, release observer overhaul. There we go. So re-architecture, new event trait. Every event now has an associated trigger. The trigger defines the behavior of world trigger for that event. Trigger defines which observers will run, the order they'll run in, and the data that's passed to them. So the really confusing thing for 0.17 with respect to this code specifically is that every time moving forward in this stream, when I say event, I'm going to mean observer. Which is, it's going to be a vibe. Everyone's going to be confused for a couple weeks, I think. All of the educational material that exists is going to need an overhaul. The video I made on observers will need an overhaul. Let's see. At a glance, default event derive and usage hasn't changed much, just some shorter, clearer naming. So again, these are 0.16 observers are now events. So add observer with an observer that can be triggered. When you trigger that, you trigger it with the event and the data. Oh no, it just wrapped my head around the distinction between events and observers. So the distinction hasn't changed. So if you did wrap your head around, you're just flipping the vocabulary. As long as you know the distinction between them, that distinction hasn't changed. It's just what we're calling them has changed. But yes, this is going to be confusing just from the vocabulary perspective. Okay. So this is global by default. The only difference between these two code blocks is the difference from trigger to on. So they're no longer, how do I say this? I think they are triggers, but the word that you use to define the argument is on. One thing that I've found myself doing, it doesn't work as well for game over. But if for like on add, on insert, on thing that happened, then this variable becomes inserted or added or something like that. So you get like the event and like the past tense of whatever that event is. In this case, it's like on game over. I don't know how I would translate that pattern. Game overed. Game ended, I guess. Right? Yada yada. Internally, things are a bit different. Yep, defaults to global. Nope, I don't know of any. I also don't have any interest in them. Zero interest in seeing that happen. I have not seen any valuable output from them. I have seen quite a bit of confusion caused by them. I don't think they're a good idea. Internally, things are a bit different. The event-derived defaults to... Oh, actually, the one thing that I do have to say about that is there was some research done fairly recently that basically said people who use LLM models to do work feel 20% more efficient, but are actually 20% less efficient. So I would seriously take a look if you are actually using those. If you just feel like you are getting a boost out of them, or if you are actually getting a boost out of them. Internally, things are a bit different. Event-derived defaults to being untargeted global by setting the event trigger to global trigger. So trigger associated type on event. When it is triggered, only untargeted top-level observers will run, and there's no way to trigger it in a different context. Right. Can't target entities if you're a global trigger. The other thing that I have to say on that topic is that Bevy is perhaps the worst use case for it, because Bevy is one of the best, most well-established collections of human-curated, up-to-date examples of any project that I've ever seen. So, like, for example, if I was like, hey, I don't know how to do... That's not what I was going to do. I don't remember how to do shaders. We have 0.17 now. I don't know how to write a shader. I go to the shaders directory, I go to shader material, and this is the up-to-date API for any given version going back as far as this example existed for how to write a shader in that version forever. Using the right APIs, using the things that you're supposed to use, using not deprecated things, etc. So I think that there's a lot of human effort that goes into making those resources available, and to dump them into a bucket that was going to give you the wrong answer anyway is probably a disservice to yourself. You're going to ask about shaders, thank you. Yeah, go to the examples. Go to the examples. There's a bunch of examples. There's a regular shaders directory, and there's a shaders advanced directory. Some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier in the stream is in the advanced directory, so like custom render phases or custom phase items and things like that. I think post-processing is also considered advanced right now. But all of the more beginner level stuff, more of the initial stuff, the material trait, extending standard materials, etc., animated like texture arrays and things like that, that's all in the shader directory. So a global trigger can only be a global trigger, which is nice. I like that, actually. Entity event. A dedicated trait for entity targeted events. I think this is the verbiage that I suggested. I'm going to have to go back and check. I think I suggested entity event for this in the engine dev channel a while back. In previous versions of any event could be optionally triggered for any entity. It looked like this. Trigger targets. Yep. So this is triggering an observer for all these targets. Or rather, it's sending the event to that entity, which could then propagate and trigger it somewhere else. But, you know, we're not there yet. So there's event and there's entity event, and these are different things, it sounds like. Are they super traits? Let's go to the docs. Let's go to 0.17. Let's go to event. Bevy ECS event. Event is something that happens at a given moment, yada yada. World trigger. Where's entity event? Oh, the docs broke. We're going to go to the secret docs. The secret docs that you're not supposed to look at. You didn't see this. Entity event. Yep. So if you implement entity event, it must implement event. Cool. Good to know. So event and entity event are not two separate things. Entity event is a specialization of event. What's the best way to debug WGSL code? You have a shader that doesn't work, but Bevy doesn't even show compile errors. Shaders are tough. Debugging shaders is tough. It depends what kind of error you're happening. Like what kind of error is showing up. If you are on a system that RenderDoc supports, or you could use something like Xcode. RenderDoc and getting used to code, or getting used to using programs like RenderDoc is super useful, but it is overwhelming to look at this code. Or not to look at this code, to look at this interface. If you're really trying to debug things and you're not sure what data is there and you're not sure if it's getting into the right places, this will show you all of the things at all of the points with all of the draw calls, everything. So this is the heavyweight way to do it. As far as like the alternative that people typically do, which is like use a debugger or printf debugging, you know, printf debugging in shaders is basically show a color, show a different color, convert it into a color and show it. If you have a shader that doesn't work and doesn't show compile errors, it might not be running. So I would start with making that WGSL file have a syntax error. And if the syntax error shows up, if it crashes, then you know that the shader is running, and then you can start debugging, like, why isn't this shader doing what I thought it was doing? If the shader doesn't crash when there's a syntax error, then it's not getting used. And then you have to look at a different place. You have to figure out why it's not getting used. Okay. Entity events. Click now has the target entity as a field on the event. It now uses the same world trigger API that other events use. Trigger targets is gone. Okay. Every event is triggered using the same API. So they're all trigger. Interesting. So the entity event derive. Yes. We'll have an attribute that is called event target. So if we have a bunch of fields, which are for some reason a bunch of entities, we can specify which of those is the target. Cool. So everything is world.trigger now. This runs for all click events, whether they are triggered for an entity or not. This is an observer that is observing a specific entity. So when the click happens for this entity, it will run this observer. And then I think this one will also run. Yeah, you intentionally made syntax errors, but didn't show errors. It also doesn't show render meshes, which would render something with a standard material. Yeah, then you've got something else going on. That doesn't sound like shader issues. That sounds like something else. If you are spawning something in and that is not getting rendered, I would start looking at things like, do you have a camera? Have you ever seen something render? Like at all? Like a cube with a mesh 3D and a standard material? It almost sounds like you don't have a camera in the scene. Okay, so entity event is a new trait with event target and event target mute. Sweet. When it's derived, it defaults to setting the event trigger to entity trigger. Everything other than the specific mesh in the scene renders. Yeah, but if it doesn't render with a standard material, then your issue isn't shaders. Your issue is something else. So if there's a bunch of things that render and that one doesn't, then what's different between that mesh and the other meshes? Or what's different in the way you're spawning that versus the others? Is what I would start looking at. When it's derived, it defaults to setting the event trigger to entity trigger. This will trigger all untargeted observers. But it will also trigger specific entities. Yes, okay. So the behavior between 0.16 and 0.17 hasn't changed. If you have a entity-specific observer and a global observer that both observe the same event, if you trigger it for that entity, it will also trigger for the global. Propagation. Propagation is off by default. And there are no APIs that control propagation. Interesting. Propagation can be enabled using the propagate attribute. So entity event propagate, and I assume you can set this to a relationship. This just said it didn't have any static. They now statically have no access to APIs that control propagation. What does that mean? Right, because this is controlling propagation. I guess they mean changing the relationship? But why would you be doing that? I guess that would be interesting as functionality, but one thing I do want to look at is this thing keeps coming up. Where's event? This associated type keeps coming up, this trigger type. So this trigger type has global trigger, which is for global observers, entity trigger, which we just went over, propagate entity trigger, which is what is used when propagation is enabled, and then entity components trigger, which is used, I guess, internally for component lifecycle events. Probably not a thing that we're going to teach, because I don't think people use component. In general, I don't feel like people understand what component IDs even are. So if you understand what they are, then you know why you would use this. But otherwise, you generally wouldn't use this. Maybe something to look into a little bit more later. Okay, so there is propagation APIs. I'm not sure what they mean by they statically have no access to APIs that control propagation. Because 2 seconds later, we get an API that controls propagation. So they must mean something else by saying that, but I'm not sure what it is. Bevy's pointer events have always tracked the original target that an entity event was targeting. This was handy. Okay, we went with original event target for the original target of the event. Is there a good way to tie observers to state? For example, to pause the game. Systems have run if in state. To tie them to a state. The systems that would be firing those events should not be firing those events. Right? Like, the observers don't run unless they're called. So there's no... The reason systems have run conditions, right, is because systems, if you add a system to like the update schedule, right, every frame that system will try to run. If you have a run condition, then every frame it will check that run condition before trying to run the system. Observers only run when they're called. So if you don't want it to run, then don't call it. Component lifecycle events. Is this what... This is observers still. Cool. Cool. On add, some minor name changes. Component lifecycle events are an entity event, and thus store the target entity as a field, and they use entity components trigger, which allows them to be triggered for specific components on an entity. I feel like coming up with an example that would make use of doing that in userland would be interesting, but I can't think of anything. That would be interesting. I feel like maintaining some kind of index, but we already have like add, insert, remove, etc. So it would have to be a different kind of action for that component. I think that's just an example we're not going to build at this point, because I can't think of like a use case that would be useful to teach. Animation events, custom events that are registered with an animation player. Animation event is a new subtrait derived, much like entity event. They don't store the entity on the event type? So an animation event then, allows you to add them to the animation. So, how do you get the things then? They don't store the entity on the event type, but they are triggered on the animation player entity. Okay, cool. I think that's good enough. Interesting that this is still called trigger. Is that true? So for animation events are associated with the animations. The players that play them are the entities for which the events fire. Custom triggers. Trigger, cool trigger. And you can kind of like quote unquote subclass event in the same way that entity event and animation event are subclassed, so to speak. Subclass is a really weird term to be using there, but hopefully y'all understand what that I mean by that. The event derived can comprise of a custom trigger. So trigger equals cool trigger with the event. So cool event is an event. We derive that for jump. We implement cool event from that derive. And I guess that means that you have access to those when the event fires is really what this is useful for. So this is like helper code so that you wouldn't have to build your own derive macro. What is this for? Trigger. Where's trigger? Here's trigger. So you're implementing one of these. Let's look at global trigger. Global trigger is probably really simple, right? Trigger internal. Yep. Let's look at entity trigger. Entity trigger. Trigger entity internal. Okay, let's start looking at the internal ones. Obviously unsafe code here, so you have to like... That says to me that you really have to know what you're doing if you're implementing trigger. Trigger itself is an unsafe function, and the trait is unsafe. So if you're going to do this, where's the code? And trigger is cool trigger, right? It doesn't show cool trigger, right? There's no code example for cool trigger. So we only have to go with these things. And the source here, it looks like implementing trigger is unsafe. Yeah, trigger is unsafe. So the trait is unsafe. So in general, that means that most people aren't going to do this. So I think that that's another thing that we kind of like don't talk about for the most part, unless we can come up with a really good example. You guess the trigger can be used for something like marshalling events, like do not send twice the same event in a row or something like that. I wonder if that's true, right? Because this calls trigger, right? So This is responsible for triggering multiple observers. If you have two events that come in that call this trigger function, then they will both run all of those observers. There's no local state, so you would have to store that somewhere, but you only get a deferred world, so you can only read, right? So I don't think that this can be used for that. I don't think that marshalling events like that, or like debouncing, is really what you're talking about, right? Like a couple of them come in and you only fire one. I don't think this can do that. Deferred world, you can read from it, you can call commands on it, but you can't mutate it. So where would you store the state for when this was getting called? Trigger context is probably not shared, right? Specific event. Right, disallows structural ECS changes. But is updating a resource considered a structural change? I actually don't know offhand. I think initializing and spawning is, but maybe not mutating. So theoretically you could then. Right? If you can get that resource... Does deferred world have access to mutable resource? I know this is like tangential, but I'm interested in this question. Deferred world. Get resource mute. Yeah. Okay. So you could. You can. You can absolutely implement debouncing if you want to, through some like store a resource and only fire them off if, you know, whatever. You would have to figure out how to do things like track time, etc. Or like figure out when to clear that resource, presumably via some system that was not in the observer or in the trigger implementation. Sorry. So yeah, theoretically, I think you could do that. Whether it's meant for that, I don't know. Yeah, resource definitely seems possible. That seems like a really cool thing that I might want to do on my own time. Let's see. Debounced observer via trigger implementation and resource storage. Seems interesting. I would play around with that. Yeah, just trying to imagine what cool trigger could be. Yeah. Well, if it can be debounced, right, then it can be anything with an event stream effectively. Right? You could accumulate a number of events and combine them and then send off one event. You could prevent multiple events from firing within a time frame. You could I guess process them into multiple or other events, maybe. I don't know if the type signatures would work for that, and that seems a little bit on the it would be easier to do that in an observer kind of way. right? Like if you're going to take jump and cool trigger is going to split that into, I don't know, vertical movement and horizontal movement, because who knows what we're doing here. And trigger two different observers for vertical and horizontal movement for some reason. It seems easier to do that without the trigger by just defining a global observer and then refiring those two events. That seems easier than trying to implement a trigger. So that's the other thing, right? It would have to be a thing that could be useful, that would be necessary to implement as a trigger and not as a global observer. It's unclear to me if this derive is like provided by Bevy in some way. Or if this is like a theoretical, create your own event derive and then do the same thing. What if you need multiple events to possibly send one? That's not doable in observers. Multiple events to send one. Yeah. Yeah, like if something happens and then another thing happens and you need both of them to have happened before the event fires. I mean, I feel like at that point you're just storing them in a, like, either component data or a resource in the observers, right? Like if you're doing two key pressed events in close time, right? Then you have some resource that is like press chain or like, I don't know, Konami code tracker. And that Konami code tracker tracks those events as they come in, right? So you would have some number of events that come in that update that resource, and then presumably you would check that resource for changes, right? Maybe not. Maybe that does make sense. I'm trying to think about how you would assuming that they are different observers for the key presses, right? Like you've got key press up and key press right or something. And those are two different observers. Those can both access the same resource because they will be operating at different times, so they could be updating it mutably. Like the obvious solution is just to check in the last observer, or the one that would be the last observer, but that doesn't feel like a composable way to define them. Rewriting history. If tracking past event, it would need to remove the past key pressed and replaced by a key combo. Yeah. I mean, I see what you're saying, right? If you can change the event in the trigger. I don't know if you can. It feels weird also. You would have to do some unsafe stuff. But yeah, anyway, some interesting ideation around what it would mean to have a trigger like that. Maybe I'll search the Discord later and see why this exists. I mean, obviously this exists because it's useful for entities, for animation players, for global events. Like the implementation of a trigger is useful. But what other implementations for triggers could be useful? Concept clarity, events versus messages. This is the rename. And basically, the event readers of 0.16 got renamed to message readers. That's the big thing. So component hooks sound like they haven't really changed. So this doesn't change. This life cycle doesn't change, right? These are all the same. Observers is the first change. On despawn doesn't exist anymore, right? This is on add. So let's go for all of these triggers. Get rid of those. And all of these are now on insert example component, on whatever example component. This is all going to be entity. Those are no longer function calls. So this is what, the third one? The example you're looking for is downward propagation for the triggers. Or for the custom trigger implementation. So the capture process, basically. Because we have, well, downward propagation. Hopefully I'm here late, but still hype. Downward propagation. Right, because you would have to expand the number of entities that are receiving. And that relation only goes in one direction for the propagation? Event entity. Where's our propagation? Trigger. So you're saying that to implement capture, you would need to implement a custom trigger? Is that what, is that? Yeah. Right, propagate, this uses child of. Child of is go to the parent. That is from many to one. So there's one route back up the tree. But if you want to go to many, interesting. Trying to think of, because like I could think of an example that is like a central command root entity and then like a bunch of turrets that are children that have a relationship that is not child of but is like turret of, which you would then need to grab all the turrets and trigger on. But if you were triggering fire in that way, you would do it on the root, which would have access to all the entities already. So you wouldn't need downward propagation. Trying to think of something that's more along the lines of like maybe conveyor belts that fork off or something that have downward propagation. I have to go back and look at the trigger implementation and play around with it a little bit, I think. That's actually, I think that's the example then. I think a conveyor belt that splits, that has like slots on the conveyor belt that splits into two. Those two are connected back via, I don't know, conveyor of or something. I guess you need to like make a decision at that point though. So it really wouldn't just be an arbitrary split. Like you have a send event that sends it to the next lane or next like conveyor belt. It sends to the fork. The fork maintains like an observer with some local state that picks one 50-50 and sends it to that one. Or splits it and sends it to both. I don't know. Requires more thought, I think. I don't see a lot of uses for capturing even on the web where it exists. Maybe something in the UI realm. These all seem like they're working. Add, insert, replace, remove, add, insert, spawn, replace, remove. Cool. It's complaining that the assets directory doesn't exist, but that's not really an issue. We can create it. I need to get off VS Code assets just to get rid of the warning. This won't go up into the Git repo unless I put a git ignore in it, but it's fine. So that's that observer stuff. This is lifecycle. This is despawn, I guess. Deferred. Get our changes in here for ons, targets to entity. I feel like these, am I gonna call these trigger when I make a video about this is really the question in my head. Are we calling these trigger in the documentation? Because those aren't triggers anymore, right? Trigger is now a trait. Trigger is something you do. It's not the event. So what are we calling on verbiage wise? Trigger is now on. On encourages developers to think of this parameter as the event itself. Okay. So I think we rename all of these because there is no word. There's like trigger is not what I would want to teach people anymore. Asserted. Replaced. Right. I think this is what I'm going to go with. Right. Removed entity reads really nicely. Like the target is the removed entity. The trigger is the despawned entity. So I think that's the change that I'm going to make verbiage wise, which means that I need to make it here as well. Inserted, replaced. These spawns. Hooks don't change, right? We didn't call these triggers at all. Let's see. Trigger on add example component. Dot entity. Same things. This is added. Added. Get rid of trigger. We run this. This is cargo run number 5. And this is our global versus local explanation. Global 13, target 13, global 14, target 14. So these are very straightforward. The observers are either a global observer or an observer on the entity. You get the same entity for both. It triggers both every time. Very straightforward. More trigger. Trigger targets doesn't exist anymore. These are all triggers. So let's start with target here and change it back to entity. Trigger targets is just trigger, right? And then interestingly, this becomes a question of triggering multiple entities is now multiple triggers. Is that what we're going with? Right, trigger targets on a group of entities. So you cannot trigger for a batch of entities, is what I'm seeing here. That has gone away. So if you want to trigger for a bunch of entities, you would need to loop. And trigger, and then these events then would need to have the entity on them. So overall, this was just showing a custom event, right? So we get to do whatever we want here. Right? So this would be an entity event then. This ID would become entity. And then this, interestingly, we no longer get the duplication, because we either have the entity in the event and it matters, or we don't have the entity in the event. So the question is, because you could make that an option, right? And say, hey, this can trigger in both ways. But I think from reading the migration, or like the observer rework information, that this is really not an intended use case. So this becomes really no longer important, because if you're going to trigger it for multiple events, you just do a for loop. Everybody knows what a for loop is already. You don't need to tell people that there is like a new thing for a for loop. So this is now just, I think this example might not be necessary anymore. Do we have a custom? Observer's recursive. So this then, I think the question is, if this is going to show off custom events in local and global, that's entity event and global event, right? Or just like a regular event, about the global trigger. We're effectively showcasing global trigger and entity trigger. I forget what it's called. Event trigger, global trigger and entity trigger, and then propagate entity trigger. So conceptually, deriving event for one event, entity event for another, entity event with a propagation for a third. Is that useful as a distinction? Because we've already talked about global versus local, right, in 5. This is on add. So this is global versus local. I don't think we need global versus local. I think this is just custom event. So if we do this and we say my global event, is this too confusing to have 2 random events? Right? I think changing this would make sense. We've already talked here about how a global observer and a local observer interact, right? On add is a great example of that, because on add can either be done globally or be done per entity. So here we don't really need to talk about that. We can just say, here's a global event. This doesn't have an entity, so we don't log anything out. Then we have our entity and our trigger, and then we have a global trigger. And this is the 6. Right, and then we get on my event target 13, entity 13. I guess we don't want to name this target anymore because it's not target, right? So we'll just call this entity. But at that point, we actually don't need to. So we can just log out the event. So we're logging out the event in both places. We've got a global event and a local event. We trigger them both. And it's basically just like, hey, here's a global event, here's a local event. We talk about propagation here somewhere, right? Bubbling. So when we talk about bubbling, we'll talk about that propagation. but we don't need to do that here, I don't think. I think that's right. I think that aligns with the general upstream mentality. There are global observers, and there are global events, and there are events that are targeted at entities, and these are different things, and they are different events. You can make them the same thing. You can do that. But that is not the way that the ethos is going. So we'll go with observers recursive. Moving on. This is just going to be on my event, right? Trigger.target. This is my event. Spawn n times. This is global, right? So target no longer exists. So we just delete that. Cargo run 7. And then we've got 43210 done recursing, 210 done recursing. Gives us a good sense of like what happens here, because all we're doing here is setting up a trigger or triggering an event that should recursively run 5 times, recursively run 3 times. And this indicates that they both run to completion before the next one runs, which I think is interesting. Cool. And then bubbling, we don't have trigger targets anymore. We're going to need to put this entity on that event. So our event is here. This is going to be entity, right? Trigger is going to be on. We didn't leave a trigger around over here, did we? Yes, we did. What do we call this? Because it's not like my event did, right? It's not spawned. Just call it my event. It is the event according to Upstream's documentation. So we just call it the event. Did I leave trigger around over here? I did. Did I leave trigger in here? Let's see, concepts, hooks and observers. 10.6 has trigger, 9, 8, 7. I think we're good. 3. 3 still has trigger. So maybe we don't name these past tense. Maybe we stick with the event name, because the guidance is these are the event. So we could do like on add if we wanted to prefix them. Got a couple of these that I'm going to fix here. Reads a little bit weird, like despawn entity, but it's like the despawn event entity. Okay. So we've done recursive. We're up to observer bubbling. So this is propagation, right? We've got a hierarchy here with that fancy new children macro. Root first, second, third marker. This is triggering for a target, so we need to move this event in. We already did that. This trigger is my event. Target doesn't exist anymore. It's weird to see my event.event, but I guess because the deref is on there. Auto propagate is not the way that we're doing that anymore, is it? Where's documentation? Propagate. Propagato. Where's propagate? Event, triggers, entity events. Trigger contains maybe that documentation. Propagate. Auto propagate is true. This would have to be an entity event for propagation to matter, right? So maybe the documentation is over on entity event. Entity event propagation. It just says entity event propagate. We can specify the target. Entity event propagate. So traversal is no longer a separate thing. It's entity event propagate equals. Why is that? Oh, because we're not deriving entity event here. So that attribute macro is no longer available. Okay, cool. And then this is just trigger, and this is with the entity. Dereference because it's single. And overall, that seems fine. That's a replication of what was previously there. Observer bubbling. This is trigger on my event. This doesn't propagate, does it? So entity event propagate children of, or child of, right? And entity. We're triggering for the marker, propagating on child of, and this fires once on my event. It fires once globally. Is there something else we need to do to get it to propagate? Do we have to enable propagation like this? That would be weird, right? Or does this only fire for one global observer? Okay, interesting. Is that a behavior change? Let's see. We can't add observers like these. So... Oh, that's annoying. Interesting. Okay. I think that we are only getting the global observer once. The question is this propagating at all? Let's add observer or observe. Are we still using the observe? Yeah, observe nomenclature. Let's grab the event and the logic. So hopefully this fires. And it does not. Okay, so are we doing something wrong? We're triggering for the entity that is on entity event. We have decided that the relationship is child of. Let me get rid of child of just as a sanity check. This triggers and then fires once globally. So this is not propagating. Oh, auto propagate. Okay, so we have propagate, which enables the propagation APIs then. And we have auto propagate, which enables automatically propagating. So this should fire. Okay. So that gives us global, 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 local. So it propagated automatically all the way up the tree. I think this is... So can you, like, my event dot propagate true. And what is the issue here? Mutability. I feel like automatic propagation is generally the way that people are going to use this the most. But I guess... Can you prevent it from propagating if it's auto? Yes. Okay, I think it's not as important to show the explicit propagation APIs. I don't think the local observer is particularly necessary. We're triggering this. It is propagating. It's automatically propagating. It goes up the tree. We can see that happen. I think that's fine. Yeah, 17, 16, 15, 13, done. Okay, I think that's good. Let's say, do we have any triggers here? Nope. Okay, so we're back into bubbling custom. Let's see. I go back and forth on this being an inventory example. I think inventory is really interesting as a concept for relationships, but I think that most of the people that I've talked to, when you say inventory to them, they go to like Baldur's Gate 3 inventory and not anything else. And Baldur's Gate 3 inventory is not something that you would do with relationships like this. So So let's update the example, and maybe I'll change that later. Right, target is no longer here. Event catch fire is now trigger target, so it needs to have an entity inside of it. Off-topic question: is there a good example for a farming game in Bevy? A lot of 2Ds tutorial you can find are platformers. Yeah, I think platformers are really popular. I can't think of any farming game examples, unfortunately. See, 9. Observers bubbling custom. And then this goes through. If we trigger it, it triggers on the paper. It goes up to the chest. That is exactly what it should do, right? Paper through the inventory to the chest. That's showing what we wanted it to do. And we'll just say that this is entity. So I think this is fine for now, but I'll probably, I don't know if I'll change this. I think it's like the inventory example here is good, right? But inventory, I think, means too many things to too many people. You're trying to follow a Godot tutorial and trying to convert the logic to Bevy, but you don't know enough Godot or Bevy to do it properly. Yeah, I feel that. I know that vibe. The people in the Bevy Discord are super helpful if you ask questions and stuff. Especially if you show up with, hey, I tried this and I can't get it to work and I don't know why. So that is bubbling with custom APIs or custom relationships. And then trigger on add, trigger entity. So trigger observer doesn't exist anymore, does it? I guess the API isn't erroring out, so let's see. Cargo run 10. So this gets global observer. I think one of the reasons I have this example in here is because there's a misconception that you can't have an observer and a target that are the same entity, and you absolutely can. I think that people get caught up in the sugar APIs. That is the add observer or the dot observe. And they forget that you can actually watch an entity, put that observer onto something, and then use it. Okay, so that all said, all of that feels pretty good overall. Events are global by default, re-architecture, add observer, on things, global triggers. I think that mostly talking about triggers isn't that interesting. The animation event might be interesting for the observers. So maybe I'll make a note. Say stream notes. Animation player, animation event, observer example. Propagation we've covered. Component lifecycle events. Animation event is the other thing. Custom event triggers I'm probably just never going to talk about, honestly. Talking about an unsafe trait, I feel like if you are ready to use an unsafe trait, then you know enough to know that an unsafe trait exists. I think that's it for observers. I don't think the observer changes are technically difficult. The terminology is the big thing. Right? Like how we talk about them has changed. What we call them has changed. So maybe one more example here that is an animation example. And clearly indicates that the animation player. You know what I should do? Animation player events for skiing with GLTF stuff. That's an example that I should have. Let's see. So let's hooks and observers. MIP maps, I haven't shipped the video on this yet. I think these are all fine. These probably just run. This is mostly like... Oh, not available there. Yeah. Manual MIP maps. So this is a visualization of the MIPS. And then the second one is the dpdy derivatives. So, ooh, there we go. Material pipeline. I think that's just, let's get rid of all of these prefixes. Import. Get rid of self because self doesn't exist there anymore. No more type argument. And then shader ref is in shader. And render asset usages. Apparently not. It's private there, so where is it? Is it not being used? Was I just not using it? Sweet. Let's leave filter type there. dpdy derivatives. So this is, if I remember correctly, the MIPS on the left and the dpdy, so the derivative of the y, which is basically like, you think of a vertex, or not a vertex shader, a fragment shader is operating on a single pixel, but it doesn't actually operate on a single pixel. It operates on like a 2x2 block of pixels. And the dpdy, dpdx functions are the derivative across those 2 pixels in each direction. So that's what this red color is on the right. That you can see kind of getting more red or less red depending on how much that's changing. And then you can see the correlation to the MIPS. So these basically move at the same spot. And then I think the third one is just hard versus, yeah. So this is like before the interpolation on these MIPS was bilinear, if I remember correctly, and this is not interpolated. So this is just a hard edge where all the MIPS are being used in all those places. This needs to turn into a video at some point soon. Somebody asked me for this. I said I would work on it. I started building it. My issue is I feel like I can't come up with a good enough example that works across enough monitors that people will be able to run and then run with MIPS and be like, oh, that's better. So I need to come up with that example and then I can ship that. Relationships haven't changed much, if at all. Spawn related. This should spawn a cube with 2 eyes. Yeah. So maybe I'll go back and revisit the relationship stuff just as a like sanity check to make sure that there's no new patterns that have popped up that are interesting to talk about. But I don't feel like the relationship stuff has changed all that much. And then spawning, these are probably all fine too. So I think what that says is there needs to be a video on observers specifically, because those are events now, and that is a huge thing. And then I think everything else, like the old video, just works. Like these, we don't even have to change these for them to run. They don't even have any warnings, which is really interesting. It's really interesting to see, like, from release to release, what actually doesn't need literally any changes and what does. Spawn UI. UI stuff might need a check. Impl bundle. Spawn with. Trigger. There we go. We've got triggers in the spawn with. On. I'm just going to leave those as underscores. We didn't get many-to-many relations in this cycle, did we? That's really unfortunate. We're not going to have the observers bundle effect. I wonder if we'll get that for 18. And then inventory is the last one. And there's no changes to this one. Yeah. Cool. So this is, everything is fully updated. Hooks and observers, maps, relationships, spawning APIs, all the examples that are going to be updated for now. The libraries, Bevy shader utils, pre-pass debug, the blockout are published. Did I not push this earlier? Okay. So I feel like I'm going to put this up in a PR. For the updates. Cool. A lot of changes. Nothing too serious though. A lot of renames and stuff like that. Nothing. We had to disable Bevy Inspector eGUI until they get a release. I think I might. I don't know if I'm going to remove that from the example for relationships. It feels good to have that. Hey, XJob. How are you doing today? I think the weirdest one to me is the shader def for material bind group. That's going to be awkward to talk around teaching. Cool. Skein demo. So the Skein demo, if we run this with the file watcha, we have a this material that is two textures effectively height lerped with vertex color data defining where each of them are going to show. It's really cool because we can get this like little gradient effect depending on what colors we use. And I think that's really interesting. The thing here is slightly wrong, but I think I'm okay with that. Oh, no commits yet? What am I doing? I think I want to upgrade this to 0.17 right now. The question is, do I feel like I should do it without a commit? Let's touch.getIgnore. The issue is these aren't the textures that I want to use, so I don't want to add this textures directory. Cool. Targets. Rust format, cargo lock. So let's do the cargo stuff. Let's do the getIgnore. Let's do the source directory. And let's not commit to... Actually, let's do the shaders. But let's not commit to anything that isn't code getting checked in here. Whip. Okay. I guess the Rust format .tom will too. Okay. So assets, textures is a bunch of random substance stuff that I just threw in. That's what we're using for that information, but it's not really that important. Those are all going to get swapped out for actual like designed textures and stuff. Ooh, Avian probably doesn't have one. Bevy enhanced input probably doesn't have one. See, that's the problem with using third-party crates. I don't know that we can upgrade. Let's take a look. I would be very surprised if there were PRs for 0.17 already. It's been less than a day since it was released. There's no Bevy main here, right? No. And this doesn't use 0.17, right? We can get away. We can get away with this a little bit, but not much. So I think overall we just won't do it until Avian does an update. Did Bevy enhanced inputs? Like, I do want to be very clear that, like, even though I'm looking for 0.17 PRs and stuff, the 0.17 release candidate happened yesterday afternoon, so it has not been 24 hours. So don't expect people to have their crates up to date. Hey, just got here. What's cool with 0.17? Is there a post on it somewhere already? No post yet. If you want to know what's in, you can look at the release notes. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning of stream. I think the TLDR is Solari is very cool but experimental. There's some ergonomic stuff for UI. There's a new experimental UI set of headless widgets as well as full, like a bootstrap kind of thing called Feathers. Hot reload for Rust applications is enabled with the 0.17 release, which is very cool, but there are some serious drawbacks. Light textures or light cookies. We talked a little bit about it. I don't think I have the image up still, but like the dappled lighting in Tunic is an example of a light texture or a light cookie. Observers got overhauled. So observers are now called events, and events from 0.16 are now called messages. So no real implementation difference. Like, there's a couple of APIs that have changed and whatnot, but if you know what events are and observers are in 0.16, events are now messages and observers are now events. So just a little bit of mental rejiggering. I heard Alice wanted to separate the structs. Hope that happened. The structs didn't separate, but we just went over this, so I already have it up. The big thing is there's an event trait and an entity event trait. So you can derive event or you can derive entity event. No, that's what this is for. Don't mind asking stuff. And really what it comes down to is there's global trigger, entity trigger. I can't remember the other two off the top of my head. Where are they? Event, trigger. So there's global, entity, propagate, and entity components trigger. Entity components trigger is the one that's being used for like on add component and things like that. Propagate is what's used for when you propagate an event to another entity through some relationship. And then global and entity triggers are what you usually think of. A global observer or an entity observer. Is an event struct also usable as a message? Yes, you can derive both of them, as far as I'm aware. Let's see. Like, you have to explicitly opt into that happening, but you have to derive message and event. They're different things. Yes, the derive separated. So we have got message for batched events, we've got event for observers, and we've got entity event for targeted observers. So you now know at compile time which one you're supposed to be able to accept, which is very exciting. I think it's a really good change. It will trip everybody up for at least a week, but it is a good change. Yeah, the reason I don't think I'm going to talk about these triggers all that much, because implementing the trait is unsafe. Let's see what else was in there. Yeah, observers, atmosphere progressing really nice. They also contributed to some real-time environment map filtering. Reflect, if you're deriving reflect on your components and stuff, those are now automatically registered. You don't need to call register type anymore. startup system in the render world, specialized UI transform, more stuff can be used in isolation. There's more crates now. Some naming convention stuff. There's a viewport node that you can directly render a camera into, which is very cool. So you can directly take a camera and be like, hey, render target, show this in UI. So like if you're doing like a mini map or something like that. And then there's a new tile map chunk type. It's very bare bones. It's very, very straightforward. Not a full replacement for external crates at the moment, but the hope is that it will be at some point. Or remaking Portal in Bevy. I don't remember what the... Oh, remaking Portal? No, this isn't the Portals thing. Portals are like stencil out an area and render something behind it, or like take other approaches. This is not a portal mechanism. This is in the UI. So if you have, let's say like a mini map in the top right with some text under it showing the teams and like the kill death counts for like each team and like how many players are left, that mini map can be rendered directly from a camera to that target. So if you do something really simple, like just stick a camera directly above everything with an orthographic perspective and only render players or whatever, then that can show in the top right of the UI. So it's a UI node. It wouldn't be in world space, so you wouldn't use it for Portal. Meshlets, as always, get some improvements. I think that's pretty much it. So, I mean, it's exciting to see the release out as always. I think that the most exciting thing about 0.17 is the windfall of things that is going to happen immediately after this goes live. There are some nice improvements here that I really like, but things like porting the entire code base to run Weasel shaders instead of WGSL is hinging on 0.17 releasing. So that I'm expecting to land basically immediately. Because that'll be a really big, really long, hard PR to keep maintained. And I know, if I remember correctly, it's Charlotte doing it. But I know that Charlotte is going to have a tough time maintaining that for more than a couple weeks. Just because of how much work that will be if people start making changes and landing changes. BSN, I'm also expecting to land at some point in Maine. Which is going to be wild. So we'll have Weasel full rewrite for rendering, hopefully BSN for 0.18. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on too. Yeah, anyway, there's a lot. But we can't update any of our things to 0.17 yet. We can't update to 0.17 because none of the crates that we use are updated. Well, Scheme is updated, but that's my crate. I updated it. I don't know that I know how I would upgrade to... Let's see, do I have this? Simgine. Did they change their name? This used to be Project Harmonia, right? Simgine. Project Harmonia. Yeah. Just take a whirl. Take a crack at it. Since it's here. Since it's here, we're here, you know? Probably a bunch of trigger changes. cargo tunnel, macros, Bevy. Let's say 0.17.0-rc.1, and then just run an example. Where's the example? Let's do context switch. Just see if it works. See what the changes would need to be. I don't do a lot of work on this project, but it's very cool. Ooh, Z standard. Okay, I saw some Z standard stuff for 0.17. Maybe we leave that then. I think there was an issue for it. Z standard. This is the issue we just ran into. So we'll leave that. So Bevy enhanced input probably not going to upgrade until this goes. Avian we're probably going to have to wait on. Is there anything else? I think that's it. I think that's it for today. Oh, file watch, right? File watcher. I want to do some Substance Designer stuff. I have a whole bunch of other stuff to write. I need to update even more stuff to 0.17. All the games workshops need 0.17 updates now. But I think I'm just going to crank through those rather than do them on stream. I'm fairly happy with this, but there's some fixes that need to happen. Specifically the UV coordinate stuff. Maybe I do that PR. Anyway, I think that's it for today. Thanks everyone for hanging out. I will be back as usual, either next Saturday or Monday morning, maybe, if we do an educational stream. But thanks for hanging out, and I will see you in the next one.